Hey YouTube, this is Razor here, and I just wanted to, I just had some discussion ideas I wanted to talk about. Now, on Pojo, I've realized that some people actually believe that pendulums as a whole, the mechanic, is not overpowered. And I just wanted to kind of explore this topic here. And there are some legitimate points to each side, whether it's broken or not. So I just wanted to let you guys know what my opinion on pendulums are with regards to if they're broken or not. So I'm just going to tell you, I believe pendulums as a mechanic is a broken mechanic. It's very overpowered. Now, I do understand that, Konami can balance it and, try to make pendulum decks, more fair. But that ultimately like kind of circumnavigates the whole issue. I mean, if you're saying like, well, you can make pendulum decks fair as long as you limit them or restrict them in some way. Does that actually change though the fact that they are broken as a mechanic? That actually would point to the fact that they have to place restrictions or limitations. I mean, think about it this way: when you have pendulum or non-pendulum decks that have, you know, X archetype, whether it's Fire Fist or gadgets or whatever, monarchs, they all have the ability to search or plus off of some kind of searching effect, right? So if a non-pendulum searches one card out of the deck, that's considered to be fair. That's a standard effect in the game that people have been accustomed to. I mean, back in the day when searching was not as rampant, I mean, maybe that would have been broken back then. But right now, relative to the power of the game in the meta, searching off one card in your deck is not considered to be broken. I mean, obviously it depends what you're searching, but generally, based on what you can search right now from your decks, if it's just, X archetype card from the deck, usually it's not overly broken, then, searching one card off your deck is not, such a ridiculous effect. Now, when people start saying, well, Cleafort's got Scout limited to one, that just now Cleaforts are a fair deck. So by them actually admitting that they should have limited Scout because it's a scale completer, they're actually admitting to themselves that pendulums are a broken mechanic. They just don't realize it. Because if you take two cards and their effects side by side and compare them, if one deck X archetype searches X card from that archetype versus pendulum searching their own card from their deck, what's the difference? One is abusing the mechanic more and can take more advantage of that search versus the X archetype because they're limited to what monsters they currently have out or what they can, spam out of the deck with that current monster's effect or whatever, right? So with that, you've got pendulums. They have the same effect, right? They have the same effect to search off one card. But then they go apeshit of like, oh, that's so broken because now you can complete your scale with just one card. Well, doesn't that actually point to how broken the mechanic is then? I mean, you just gotta like stop having this bias of saying, oh, well, we're gonna say that searching a card from your deck is normal, but if it's a pendulum card, then that's totally broken. I mean, that's just a double standard there. So that obviously means that the pendulum mechanic is broken. Now you can certainly now some people may argue like, well, we have better monsters than pendulums and whatnot, but if you actually compare them side by side, what is actually in the text? If a monster is broken, if a non-pendulum monster is broken, I can guarantee you it's because they had to add walls and walls of text, make multiple and several texts in that jam into that one card to make that broken versus a pendulum monster which has just maybe like one or two effects, and then they would also have a pendulum effect, right? So a monster effect, a non-pendulum monster effect, has to be insanely broken in order for them to actually be better than pendulums. So them saying like, oh well, we have non-pendulum decks that are also broken, so that doesn't mean anything. Pendulums aren't necessarily broken. That's a stupid point. That's like saying, you know, as long as it's like saying I'm not a big sports fan, but just say like it's like saying, you know, X sports team, like insert your favorite sports team. Let's say if X sports team didn't have X pro player playing, then the inferior team would win. Well, no duh, because you're not comparing them, you know, from an objective standpoint. So my point is pendulums are broken if you compare them side by side, and like people have made the case like, well, you know, if you compare Joker, Skull Crobat Joker, the Pendulum Monster, he only gets a search when he's normal summoned versus Stratos, who's a lot better because he can be special summoned. Well, that to me tells me you're just not comparing them fairly because Stratos obviously has a better effect applied to him, while Skull Crobat Joker has a limited effect because they know if they allow Joker to have the same exact effect as Stratos, it's going to be abused a whole lot more with the pendulum mechanic. So that ultimately points back to comparing them side by side. If you compare the monsters side by side, the pendulum monsters are just going to outclass regular monsters no matter what. And people have been saying, well, you know, when you pendulum summon, you have to have a 2-card investment first and blah, blah, blah. And I'm telling them that's really a moot point because, I mean, first of all, those cards usually have a pendulum effect. So it's like you're activating a continuous spell that has an effect, usually, if it's good. If they're like ignites, well, you see how ignites were. They kind of fell to the wayside. They were power creeped because they were considered a more fair pendulum deck that was, you know, restricted in design. That just points to that either a pendulum has to be severely restricted in their design or their archetype in order for other decks to compete, where other decks are stacked with more walls of text of effects. So like and the argument that's saying like, oh well, pendulums take a 2-card investment, you won't always have the right scales, that's BS. I mean, that's like saying, oh well, X archetype isn't always going to have X card to do X combo. That it's just stupid. Like, oh yeah, like as long as Cosmos doesn't have Dark Destroyer in their hand with Farm Girl, they're not gonna be overpowered. And this is not to say Cosmo is overpowered or anything. I'm not trying to get into that, but just as an example, you know, you get my point. Is a good card, if you don't have that with X card, then you can't do this broken play. That's basically what they're saying. Like, oh, pendulums take a 2-card investment. Well, no dud. In this card game, cards combo off with each other. You need multiple cards to do things. There's no question about that. So that's just besides the point. And that's just my entire argument on pendulums. I'm just sick and tired of hearing people saying, oh, pendulums are not OP, but then they apply their ridiculous double standards and say, well, pendulum searching effects are overpowered because now they can complete their scales, but then they don't realize that they're actually disproving themselves by saying, oh well, that's an overpowered effect because now you can complete your scales and then just pendulum 5. And it's like, what did you expect? You know, that's the pendulum mechanic, that's why it's broken. So that's just my take on pendulums and why they're broken as a whole.